So welcome, I'm Susan Beck. We're here today to talk about the accommodations topic and universal design for learning. So I'm glad you're here today. Let's get started. So this training is being offered through Family Connection, which is South Carolina's parent training and information center, which of course provides special education training and assistance to families of children with disabilities. And just for your information, every state has at least one of these parent training information centers. So we're glad that Family Connection in our state is so well established and strong and can offer trainings of this type. The training today will be posted on the website, so that's why we're recording it for the convenience of folks who weren't able to attend today and for your future reference. Our objectives today are that we will focus on understanding the laws related to accommodations and also the principles for universal design for learning as it relates to accommodations. The participants will gain skills and use of accommodations within that IEP process, and then you'll be able to identify different types of accommodations for instruction and testing. We did a little pre-test poll, pre-training poll at the beginning here, and we'll do it again at the end, just to kind of look at what you've learned today, and we'll go through those answers. As I mentioned kind of before we started recording today, if you have individualized questions really specific to your personal needs or your students' personal needs, Ms. Wingard has entered the information to do that referral link there today. Please feel free throughout the training to enter any of your questions in chat, and we'll go through those periodically and certainly at the end. Okay, so let's get rolling. So we know the basis for all the information we're going through today is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So I'll share with you kind of where those code references are. Those are listed at the bottom of your screen of your slide. So it all starts with supplementary aids and services, and understanding that definition is a good basis for our training today to kind of jump off. And those refer to those supports that are provided in the regular education or general education classes or other education related settings, and also in those extracurricular and non-academic settings. And these supplementary aids and services enable students with disabilities to be educated with students without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. So another reference to those supplemental aids and services goes in 34 CFR 300.320A4, and that refers to students being expected to advance appropriately toward attaining their annual goals, to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum, and then to be educated and participate with other children with disabilities and students without disabilities. We also have a reference to including in the IEP a statement of any individual appropriate accommodations necessary to measure academic achievement and functional performance on the child on state and district-wide assessments. So this really refers to that testing portion of the IEP and any necessary accommodations or modifications. We'll talk about modifications a little bit later. So let's talk a little bit about requirements for general education teachers in the code. The requirement with respect to these teachers are that they're using appropriate positive behavioral interventions and supports and other strategies, as well as those supplementary aids and services. So when an IEP addresses accommodations, it should specify the settings in which those accommodations are expected to be used. And sometimes those are the general education setting, but certainly also it applies to the array of special education services being provided. So general education teachers play an important role. That's why it's so essential that they stay for the entirety of the IEP meeting so they can share their observations and give their input as to how those accommodations are being used, if they fit well with the needs of the student, and also if they need to be adjusted. Another code reference, it should be assured that these accommodations are put in place to to provide an appropriate education, and that they're designed to meet individual education needs of people with disabilities. They refer to as handicapped persons here, as adequately as the needs of non-handicapped persons are met. So within this section, it's really referring to that, removing all those barriers so the person can access all of those things that education provides. Okay, so let's kind of dig in a little bit further and talk about accommodations versus modifications. So I think when we are familiar with those words, just as words of the English language, we have our concepts of those things. Within special education, they are very specific. While there are lists of accommodations and modifications, there are certainly lots of creative ones that can be created or designed to based on the individual needs of students. So let's talk about the differences. First, accommodations. This is a change to the instructional or testing procedures and materials that allow a student to fully access the information. And the key there, kind of that last little piece, is to accurately demonstrate knowledge. So again, we're removing barriers. We're not changing expectations for what they learn. We're not trying to reduce the requirements of the task by assigning them a completely different assignment. We're not changing what the student's required to learn at all, but we're meeting their unique needs. And the uniqueness is key, because the assumption is not that every category or every student within that category of disability needs the same thing. It's this student on this day, given this task, how can that be individualized? Hopefully that makes sense. So accommodations remove the barriers for learning and engagement because of that disability. Ideally, they're increasing participation in academic and non-academic activities. And the goal there is to allow students to show what they know. So they're able to demonstrate their knowledge in maybe different ways or respond in different ways, but the difficulty of the task has not changed, and the content material has not changed. Okay, now you kind of got an orientation on accommodations and how we're going to talk about that today. Let's switch over and talk about modification. So just that word itself, when you think about it, before we get into the slides, modifying something is really changing something. So you're not really accommodating differences, you're really changing, you're modifying the instruction or the curriculum. So you're altering either the content of the instruction or how the student performs the expectation. So in kind of a spectrum of things, modifications are more intensive or intrusive or severe than accommodations are, because we're changing that expectation or reducing the requirements of the task. So a modification could be things, we'll talk about them more, but things like changing the grade level difficulty of material. Okay, so digging back into accommodations, we have two types of accommodations that we'll talk about today. We have instructional accommodations and then testing accommodations. So first, instructional accommodations. As far as delivery, that's when it changes the way the teacher delivers the materials. So that could be all the different methods, like orally or in writing or in print or electronically. Adaptations of materials, so changing the materials used for instruction so the person can see them better, or they're organized differently. Maybe there's not so much on a page. Those are some ideas. And then engagement, changes in the way the student interacts or participates in the classroom. So that can be, kind of how, an example, the teacher might ask comprehension questions or have preferential seating so the student can make better eye contact with the teacher or be closer to the point of instruction for better monitoring to make sure that they're understanding. Okay, then testing accommodations are a little bit different. They affect changes in how the student is tested, but doesn't change what's being tested. So a lot of times you'll see in IEP small group testing. That's an example there. So two types of skills are needed during assessment. the target, and the access. So when we talk about that, the target skills are the knowledge being assessed. Examples are like reading comprehension or math calculation, any of those academic type skills, or if the target is on a science test, our example here is identifying the bones in the body. And then secondarily, access. So accessing skills refer to the skills needed to complete the assessment, but are not being measured. So reading questions on a test when reading's not being measured, that could be a possible accommodation. So if reading comprehension is being measured, we have to ask ourselves, would we read the test to the student? No. So we would want to test actual comprehension of reading in that case. So that's why it kind of specifies here, reading the questions on a test when reading is not being measured. Then writing answers to questions when writing is not being measured. And then solving math word problems when calculation is not the skill of being measured. So, sometimes accommodations like a calculator, when you're not measuring calculation, you're measuring whether the student can understand the operations instead. Universal design for learning is what we'll be talking about too, in the kind of context of understanding accommodations and modifications. And so that'll form a good basis for us today. As you see in some of the slides, we have our resources also listed. We'll have a resource page at the end, but you can see where we've gotten a lot of the content and ideas and visuals to kind of share. So universal design for learning, let's talk about that next. Here are some examples of ways the environment can be set up for success based on individualized disabilities. So it's important that all classrooms consider universal design for learning so that learners' wide range of needs can be accommodated, that age-appropriate materials are being provided for a range of abilities in the classroom, and there are different ways for students to receive and give information. They also can create inclusive environments for learning. It's really the basis in a lot of ways. When we've heard through education, we go through different cycles. We talk about differentiated instruction. We talk about universal design for learning. We talk about individualizing or being child-centered. All these are characteristics of each other and really help us design good learning environments. So there are three main areas to increase accessibility: providing multiple ways for engagement, multiple ways for representation, meaning how we present, deliver, or provide information, and then multiple ways for action and expression of knowledge and just that communication component. So let's talk about engagement. In this area, we're offering choices of content or tools. We're providing adjustable levels of challenge. So an example of that is that readability for a book. What's the reading level? We want to encourage independent reading. So we want to make sure we're on the right level. We're not at the frustration level where a student would need assistance getting through that. We're individualizing to allow students to choose reinforcers. I know a couple of months ago, I had a teacher ask me, well, what reinforcer should I use for the student? And so, of course, my answer was, it all depends. Let's do a reinforcement assessment, or let's find out, watch the student and figure out what he really likes. Let's ask him. But choosing reinforcers for kids without getting their input is a sure success for failure. So we really want to involve the students in choosing reinforcers and doing some assessment there. We also want to allow learning in different types of environment. So some kids need those seating breaks or movement breaks, standing. I had a little boy last week I was working with, and he was really active, and to get him to pay attention, I had to kind of give him some breaks and I had to let him stand. But we got through everything together, and he gave me a lot of feedback through observing him and what he needed. And so that's another way to kind of adjust that engagement. And do flexible grouping in the classroom. That's also important. So adjusting seating, adjusting small group versus large group, and also by level of difficulty of task. That's all referred to in flexible grouping. So next we'll talk about representation as a component of UDL, Universal Design for Learning. Here we're ensuring material is presented in different media. So illustrations, models, communicating. So we've got different diverse learning needs. Some kids have a real strength in verbal, some kids have a real strength in visual. And so considering that and how we communicate information to them or explain lessons, as well as how they can represent their knowledge. So maybe instead of writing a paragraph, maybe they're constructing a model to show that they understand something. We're ensuring adequate examples and non-examples during instruction. A lot of kids with disabilities really need to see that contrast. You know, we're explaining things that we have to explain explicitly, that because of their disability, they don't have just that perceptive ability to understand things. So a really good strategy is showing them an example and then a non-example. And that is also the case for social skills instruction. We've got some good resources out there that show examples and non-examples. And then also highlighting key elements. So, you know, using bold or using a highlighter, teaching use of a highlighter, all those things really kind of just make the key elements pop out visually, as well as how we're providing instruction, kind of foreshadowing and then hitting it and then reminding them and then saying it again. Also using accessible text with options for auditory and providing definitions of words. So just being able to use technology to support how we're representing. And then action. So breaking down for students to show mastery of skills, using multiple ways for students to respond to show knowledge. So that could be verbally, writing, or technology. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Some of these things overlap. And then also executive functioning. So that's referring to that kind of organizational planning component of how we learn and execute. So that's including some strategies, goal setting, planning, you know, breaking a really big project or assignment down into small pieces, using a calendar, you know, just plotting out how to do something and teaching how to attack something big by, you know, taking it into little chunks. Those are some good examples. So Universal Design for Learning increases those inclusive practices because it adapts the environment for all students. If you really want to know more about Universal Design for Learning, we've included these links, which again, we will share these slides after the presentation. You'll be able to click on those live links. There's a lot of resources out there from CAST, as well as these other links for Universal Design for Learning. So we've talked about UDL creating inclusive environments, but the thing to remember with that too is no disability is created the same for each child. You can have two students with the same learning disability and reading comprehension, but they might need different accommodations. And some students with disabilities also need more. So some kinds of disabilities or the severity of the disability. So that's where we have to remember that the goal of our accommodations are to reduce or remove the impact of the disability, and then also to increase the student's ability to participate in learning and completing the task, to get their engagement and their learning without their disability creating a barrier. So we'll talk next about ICE. And this, we'll refer to this a couple times through our presentation today. 3 steps for implementing accommodations. The I stands for identifying accommodations through assessment. The C is creating the plan and then implementing with Fidelity. And then E is evaluating for the effectiveness of the accommodation. So let's talk about those. The I, identifying accommodations. Will you be doing that through using assessment data? So the goal, as we always say with special education and working with people with disabilities, is you want to provide the right supports, the right amount, not too much, not too little. And usually in the case of accommodations, when you're trying to meet the unique needs of the student, less is definitely more. So we want to have high impact accommodations because it takes a lot of work to teach them. And also if you're accommodating all different ways, you're not really sure which one is the most effective. So that's why it's so important to do those assessments. So some types of accommodations as we go through this today. Presentation. Again, that's how material is presented. Response, that's how the student responds to material. The environment is where the material is presented. And then timing and scheduling is when the material is actually presented. So here's some examples as we kind of go across the top of this table: the presentation, the response, the setting, and the timing and scheduling. So if the presentation, some of these examples here are definitely more visual or communication or, accommodations like oral administration if a student has difficulty with reading or tracking. And then the responding, certainly, how the student's giving the output to show that they're understanding. Some setting accommodations like seating. You can kind of get the idea here, kind of the physical structure, the lighting, or kind of a behavior contract example would be, setting up conditions where a reinforcer can be achieved for completing work, or providing additional positive reinforcement. And then timing and scheduling just refers again to schedules, maybe extended time, maybe those frequent breaks, and that sort of thing. So just a few examples. You do have sent to you also in your materials for today. I'm referring to the titles over here. You have a couple documents that have listings of accommodations. Then you have another one called Selecting Accommodations, and an accommodations worksheet. So you've got a lot of resources there as a product of this training to kind of go through and think about different accommodations. Again, it's just a starter, not a menu. Go through and click, 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 but some food for thought. I did get a little feedback if you've just joined, if you will mute yourself so that we're not hearing that echo. Okay, so steps to choosing, selecting, and making sure the accommodations are appropriate. You've got to gather data and figure out what is the situation, really define what's happening, what's needed, determine the tasks that are required, and then really look through identifying the strengths of the student. There is that portion of the IEP at the beginning that talks about the strengths, and then the weaknesses and the impact of the disability. And this is where you should start building those ideas for how the accommodations may be needed, because you've identified strengths, you're identifying any barriers, and then that aids with selecting the accommodations that match the need. And then, of course, as another step, we must always check to make sure that the accommodation is appropriate. So gathering data, we definitely want to look through present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, getting input through interview with the student, as well as the parents and anyone else supporting the student, input from general education teachers about what they've seen to be really effective in their classrooms, and also incorporating gathering data from trials of accommodation effectiveness. So there are some instances where you want to actually try an accommodation and see how it works, if it fits well with the student before you put it in the IEP. And then, of course, on the data side, looking at how effective a current accommodation is. So all those things are really important as you look at accommodations. A lot of the information you need to kind of review if accommodations are appropriate or not, again, should be written into that IEP, and the strengths and the present levels and the impact of disability. That's why those sections kind of all go together and lead in. So identifying, you'll review types of academic and non-academic tasks required. So are they required to read? Are they required to work independently? Do they have to have a certain organization to be able to complete a task? Sometimes non-academic tasks come into play, like traveling in the building. So accommodations are needed there as well for students who have difficulty finding their way, or who need extra time to travel, or need to be released earlier or a little later to move between in the hallways. Um, Determine if the student's disability will impact their ability to complete the task. So is there a real basis for this? Rather, again, less is more. So we don't want to have a bunch of accommodations that are not needed just because we think they might be helpful. We actually need to prove that they're needed. And then again, look at their effectiveness. So accommodations should be revisited every time an IEP is looked at, whether you're doing a special review or an annual review, and there should be an assumption that accommodations should change over the years because the student changes, right? So let's talk about strengths a little bit more because that's a big basis for leveraging accommodations and which ones to choose and how well they'll work. So here are some basic domains as we talk about strengths that we should consider. Cognitive, certainly referring to their thinking skills. Sensory, sometimes referring to vision or hearing, but also can be the environmental kind of sensory inputs like auditory or visual, not like vision and hearing, but like what's going on in the environment, the activity level, the noise level, the smells, the sounds, all those things. Executive functioning, again, we talked about that earlier, a little bit about the organization and planning, the executing part of tasks. Motor skills could be, fine motor, which is buttoning or drawing or wiping and that sort of thing, or gross motor skills, those large body movements. Social emotional, referring to behavior and regulation of emotions, and then communication, of course, could be more expressive, being able to communicate with words, or receptive, that understanding, and any of those kind of technology or assistive technology communication kind of strategies. So let's talk about this a little bit more, this identification. So I just mentioned kind of the receptive language and expressive language part of that, and those sensory issues. One thing I didn't mention was kind of the mobility part of sensory issues. We kind of think about that paired with the motor skills, the fine and gross motor skills, and the executive functioning. So making sure that we have a good understanding of all these areas is really key, so that we can correctly understand the child's individualized strengths. Because then we'll select an accommodation based on those strengths. So again, we talked about this already, kind of that presentation, response, setting, and timing and scheduling to select that appropriate specific accommodation. Again, if you want to know more about these things, we're going through this a little quickly, but you've got those handouts with accommodations. A lot of times we get questions, what would be a good accommodation for reading comprehension? And my answer to that would be, let's look at the individualized strengths of the student, the demands of the setting, how information's presented, and then let's kind of go through it together. So that's the kind of discussion about strengths and selecting accommodations that should take place in IEP meetings. Some of these resources that we've offered below, as well as the handouts that we've shared in advance, can also help you through that process. And then it's important with accommodations to check for the appropriateness. So is the accommodation necessary? Is it really required to perform the task? Independence, can the student perform the task more independently with the accommodation? So is there really kind of like bang for your buck, or is it worth the effort because the student will be able to perform the task more independently? Again, with that eye on less is more, we don't want to, with disabilities, we want to actually keep things as typical as possible. just what are the general norms of that setting, what's a grade level expectation, how do we get to the student to be as independent as they can be without unduly changing things or making them atypical. And then generalizability or generalizable. Can the student use the accommodation for a similar task in different environments? So again, kind of to that point of what's the setting in which the accommodation may be helpful. It could be across multiple subject areas or multiple school physical settings. And then is it acceptable? Will the student consistently use the accommodation? So that's where that student assessment portion of asking the student, talking to the student, teaching them, we'll talk about teaching next in the next few slides, but really understanding will the student consistently use the accommodation? What's their comfort level with that? And do they understand how to do it? So all these things are kind of categories on one of your handouts to the accommodation worksheet as you go through and try to do the assessment part and figure out if the accommodations are appropriate. And here's an example of that. If a required task is independent reading of grade level material in content classes, and you determine that the strengths of the student are strong vocabulary and listening comprehension, so they got some really good things going on there. One of their barriers, though, is reading fluency, that speed and accuracy of reading to get through the material. A potential accommodation would be the presentation. So in order to be able to get them to access the content, although they're a really slow reader, giving them a break by changing to an auditory book or a text to speech book, you kind of go through and look at those. Is it really necessary? Is it individualized? Is it something the student understands and will use appropriately? Okay. And then the same thing, here's another example for independent task completion. If the student responds really well to visual cueing or using a timer, visual check sheets, because they're having a hard time being organized, starting and completing tasks, then they're responding, like maybe using a check sheet for independent work and a visual timer might be appropriate. Okay. So next, let's talk about creating the plan and implementing with Fidelity. So some steps for us here are: number one, has the team determined the specific accommodations and writes them in the IEP? And then two, determining the need for training for implementation. If an accommodation is selected, you've got to train to make sure that it'll be implemented correctly. And then actually three, implementing the accommodation in daily instruction and assessment across whatever settings it's appropriate, whatever time it's appropriate, and then documenting use and outcomes of those accommodations. So as you're writing the accommodations in the IEP, it's very important that the writing leaves no room for interpretation. So it addresses the what, the when, the where, the how, and all of the terminology is really clearly defined. I was in a meeting earlier this week, and one of the recommendations was preferential seating. And so, my response to that was preferential seating meaning what? Is it near the front of the class? Is it near the teacher? Is it near the point of instruction? Is it in a quiet area of the room? So let's not stop at preferential seating because that leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Let's add a little bit more to it and explain what preferential seating means. So that's why the IEP is structured that way. It lists what are the accommodations and then special instructions for how those accommodations will be implemented. Here we go. Here's the example. So specific instruction for accommodations or modifications is a section I was just referencing. So this is the kind of thing you would see in there instead of just stopping, like at preferential seating was the example I used, or digital books. It goes on to kind of explain in a more narrative way what that means. So here are some examples for you. Use of digital books with audio read aloud for grade level content area material. Or all grade level content area material will be provided orally. Here's an example of speech to text. She will use speech to text for written assignments in content areas other than instruction in writing. Again, kind of that example to reading comprehension. We wouldn't read something for a student if we're assessing their comprehension of the written word. Here, the same thing too. You could use speech to text for written assignments unless you're assessing her writing. And then pre-correction and prompts given in the classroom for work completion aligned with expectations on the behavior contract. So just ensuring some success by giving that consistent feedback and positive criticism. Okay, so as we go through and we've done this great job of figuring out what the accommodations will be, we've got to go back and teach, make sure the staff understand. The general education staff and special education staff in some instances require training. And then also having a good rapport with the student, called kind of self-advocacy. How and when, how will they give feedback, and how can they be active participants in that accommodation? And then certainly family as well, getting input from family is important. So here's an example, again, kind of focused on the assistive technology component here. So is trying to make the language as explicit as possible. The assistive technology specialist will provide direct instruction individually using the speech to text system and digital materials. The specialist will ensure all digital materials are accessible and provide training to teachers. And then behaviorally, they'll check her daily progress note each morning. So it doesn't just stop there. It says more specifically each morning and check out each afternoon. And then being even more specific, you see this reference down here to the training will occur 2 times a year. And when 2 times a year? Beginning the current IP in the beginning of the new school year, and then consistent with the pre-correcting and prompting. Okay, so you kind of get the flavor of how specific things can be. So you can kind of go through a checklist and determine, was it done appropriately or not? There isn't kind of this loosey-goosey way of writing. Okay, so as we move to implementation of accommodations, we want to make sure there's a system to document. Was the accommodation implemented and how did it work? Taking notes on the student response and effectiveness of the accommodations, and then of course keeping data on how easy or efficient it was for use of staff. So here's an example of the kind of document that's often used to write down all these specifics we've just talked about for either IEP or Section 504 documentation. So a log looking at what was the accommodation, when was it implemented, the number of times it was implemented, was it used? So if an accommodation is offered, did the student actually use it, yes or no? And then how did it go? Getting feedback from the student and the general education teacher as well. And all this can kind of be analyzed, and it could come up in discussion at IEP meetings or at parent conferences, just to make sure that we are looking at, was the accommodation actually implemented? Because we should be doing this next part, evaluating for effectiveness. So as the team prepares for the annual review, accommodation should be evaluated, and all members of the team, including the students, should provide data and input on the effectiveness and efficiency of the current accommodation. So funny, yesterday I was in a meeting and, we've got a high school student, so he was present, and, sometimes we talk before we think. And so I said to the student, so preferential seating, how's that working? Do you like that? You think that's something we should continue? And we talked about what, his preferential seating was near the teacher. And he said, no, I do not like it. And so the whole team kind of laughed with him and said, yeah, but it's good for you because you're, on your Chromebook and you're in little chat rooms, or you're on different pages, you're not following the assignment. So, some more education for the student on why preferential seating was important for him kind of came up as a a need because of asking those questions. So, students might not like accountability, but in order for them to get the most out of their educational opportunities, we want them to have the accountability necessary. And he definitely had some maturity issues using that Chromebook appropriately, just like a lot of students do. So student feedback is important. It tells us what we need to do next. Guiding questions for evaluation and determination of new accommodations. So kind of going through these 5 guided questions will lead us to the direction we need to go. So was the accommodation suitable because it removed or reduced a barrier? We want that to be the goal of accommodations. Was a student willing to use the accommodation regularly, or did they just refuse it? How did the student feel about it? Again, they don't have to always like it, but learning about how it was implemented, if they're willing to use it, and then the effectiveness of it is important to know what training, or if you need to adjust it, needs to take place, okay? Did the accommodation enable the student to be fully included in the class rather than singled out? So instead of sitting in class and practicing being disengaged, were they able to be more engaged and be more typical and stay with their grade level peers? And did the staff find the accommodations to be efficient in the classroom? Because the efficiency component is necessary. We can think maybe, teachers should just do it because it's needed. But at the same time, it has to be something that's realistic to be implemented. So is assistance needed, or resource needed, is training needed for the accommodation to be efficient so that it will be more likely to be used consistently and effectively? So we're back to our ICE cycle, the identifying the accommodations, creating and implementing the plan, and evaluating the effectiveness. So if you can see my cursor here, it's a cycle that we just keep doing over and over again. And really, in a broader sense, that's the whole idea with the individualization of IEP services. So you're identifying a need, you're identifying a strategy, you're putting it in place, and then you're measuring it to see if it's working. And if it isn't working, then we're moving on, or we're retraining, but we're doing things with Fidelity to see if they improve the situation. So we have a variety of acknowledgments and resources, as I shared with you through the slides. Lots and lots of resources out there if you're interested in learning more about accommodations and how those fit with the requirements of IDEA. As we go through kind of the end of our training here, again, I mentioned we're going to do another poll, but I wanted to share with you that, of course, Family Connection is always here. There are a variety of resources for you all to learn more about transitioning to preschool from early intervention, parent guides for baby net access, a variety of tip sheets, and a variety of parent workbooks. So those are all there. As well, if you have additional questions that you're not comfortable asking in the chat questions, we're about to go through those. If you have questions or concerns through the special education process, you can always call one of the family engagement managers at Family Connection, and they'll be glad to work with you. So before we go through the chat questions, let's go ahead and do the poll, and let's just see from the slides here how we did with learning. And then we'll go through the chat questions and we'll go through all those answers as well. Okay, so I'm launching the poll. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, I think. And you should see those poll questions. If you will concentrate and answer those, I'd appreciate it. I'm gonna give you all another couple minutes. We've got about 57% complete at this point. Okay, we're about 80% here, so I'll give you another few seconds. Remember, just answer your best. I'm really pleased with the results I'm seeing so far. I'm about to share those with you. Got about 80% complete so far. About 4 more people need to work through those questions. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end that poll and share the results. So let's kind of go through those together. You all did a great job on question 1. Accommodations change what a student is expected to know and learn. False. Right. Very good. Number 2 was definitely true. So gathering data is essential to make informed decisions about effective accommodations. Number 3 was false. We had 67% of you answering that one correctly. So the student should have a few carefully selected accommodations that are based on need rather than many accommodations. Remember, we talked about less is more. Number 4 was false. So about 61% of you answered that one correctly. So if a student's being tested for reading comprehension, let's think about reading comprehension. Do they understand what they read? An accommodation to have the passage read aloud could be provided to the student. That's why that's false, because we want to not accommodate reading comprehension if we are trying to assess reading comprehension. So that would not be an appropriate accommodation for that. And then number 5, good job, 89% true. Yes, the use of UDL does create more inclusive classrooms where children benefit from providing different ways to engage, receive information, and demonstrate knowledge. So great job there. So let's move to the chat questions, and let me just kind of go through here and see if we've got any questions we need to discuss any further there. So there was a question, how are districts using universal design for learning? What trainings are schools giving teachers? So, there are multiple school districts across the state of South Carolina, many. And so that's a question to ask locally, but as a basic foundation for special education services in the graduate training program, students who ultimately become certified special education teachers have had some training in universal design for learning. Also, the South Carolina Department of Education has prioritized that and provided a lot of training and assistance to districts. So that might be a question that would be better asked locally, but just remember, kind of as we talked about this, training should be provided in implementation of accommodations for general education teachers by the special education teachers. And that should be articulated in the IEP, how often, when, and on what. And so the use of those accommodations and setting up those classrooms to be kind of encouraging responding and engagement, all those parts of UDL we've talked about should be part of that training that goes on between special education and the general education teacher. Okay. Someone asked if the slides will be shared from today's workshop or will it only be available for recording? So that'll be posted. That an email with the slides will be sent after the training and the recording will be posted. Okay. And then I think we had another question, is that called an accommodation log? I think that was referring to the slide that was listed as a IEP or 504 accommodation log. So I think that answer is correct. And then how do we work with school districts to have more inclusive activities at school? There was this person had to push for social skills class. There's no interaction at all with typical codes. Elementary school was even worse. So those are discussions to have, maybe even outside of big IEP meetings for kids, but with the special education staff, with the school administrators, with the school psychologists, with the special education director of the district, just kind of giving that feedback if activities are not inclusive. Just kind of working across the state of South Carolina, you do see a lot of variety in the kind of complexity of the programs offered to students, as well as kind of the innovative strategies used. And it all starts with good training and good school leadership. So those educational leaders, like the special education directors or those principals or even the school psychologists and lead special education teachers, need to be getting that feedback that an additional array of services are sometimes necessary. And certainly as advocates and as parent supports and as me just as a school psychologist, we're always advocating for those things. So we had another question just come in. Thank you. How often are accommodation logs used during each year to see how, if the accommodations are effective, who fills them out? So the lead special education teacher over that student's case is usually responsible for collecting that information about how the accommodations are being used. They're in pretty much constant communication with the general education teachers, specifically if the student's mainstreamed. So that would be a question about the frequency, looking in the IEP or talking with that lead teacher about that to determine how often they're kept. Certainly, as we mentioned, the IEP and the accommodations should be reviewed at least annually. But if there are questions about the accommodations, whether they're being implemented or not, I would encourage that to be asked for that lead teacher, that case manager. And then also just seeking feedback on how the progress is going. You can have special review meetings, you can have parent conferences, you can just have phone calls and get that information and determine if a full IEP team meeting is necessary. We had another question, can the gen ed teacher on the IEP team be the gym teacher? So I understand that's not specifically about accommodations, but more about the requirements of IDEA and the folks who constitute an IEP team. And so a general education teacher could be any general education teacher. And sometimes if there are multiple general education teachers and the topic varies for the meeting, if it's really about the students reading and they're mainstream for reading, you want to have the reading teacher there. If there's a question about participation socially or with extracurricular activities or, in related arts, and the students only mainstream for art, music, PE, then a gym teacher is very appropriate. I will say that we have had to have more flexibility than typical because of COVID. And there is a real shortage of school staff right now with a lot of teachers and students being out. And so I am seeing at meetings, some general ed teachers that I wouldn't normally see perhaps, who might not have the information needed. So you can always schedule another meeting if that teacher can't come because they're out. But the gym teacher would be appropriate as meeting the general ed teacher component. They are certified general ed teacher. Okay, so I'm not a gym expert. We're getting a lot of questions about gym here. What if there's no gym teacher ever doing gym class for the special education class? The teacher does it. So in some school districts, there is, and will be listed in the IEP for the specific class, especially design PE teacher who is not, I'm not sure if their certification is special education or physical education. Again, that might be a question to ask your special education director in your school district. But sometimes that's what's offered because the large group physical education class is not appropriate because of mobility issues or comprehension issues or participation issues or just chaos issues. There are large groups of kids in PE moving around, and that can be really overstimulating. So um, I'm not sure if I can answer that question. Is what if there's no gym teacher ever doing gym class for the special ed class? So, special education is not supposed to be a class. It's supposed to be an array of services. So it's not supposed to be a room or a place. And so I always think about that kind of like with the services that are outlined in the IEP is physical education, a class that's listed there with general education, then that should be provided within the general education setting. I think that's about the best I can do today. Again, you've got your family engagement specialist at Family Connection. If you've got specific questions about PE, you could probably ask those. And I always encourage you to have a good communication with the school district special education director as well. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up today. I'm not seeing any more chat questions. I really appreciate everyone's participation today. You are great folks to train. You did a great job on your pre and post assessments, and hopefully you found this training really beneficial to you as well. I really enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time in a Family Connection training. Thank you so much. Have a great day.